Orson Hale had spent 34 winters answering alarms while other people stayed under blankets. He used to measure December by smoke calls and frozen hydrants, by the sharp smell of wet wool in the station, by the way a rescued family would cling to each other in the streetlights like they'd been given time back. Now he measured it by quieter things, a thin layer of frost on his porch steps, the muted jingles from storefront speakers, the calendar on the fridge with too many empty squares. The house still held small proofs of his late wife, an old ceramic angel in the window, a knit scarf draped over the chair as if she'd returned for it, and those proofs warmed him and cut him at the same time. The holidays made that feeling louder. His pension kept the lights on and his prescriptions filled, but it didn't buy ease, and it didn't buy the one thing he wanted most: a clean way to show up for his son's family without looking like a burden or a man asking for forgiveness with empty hands. A week before Christmas, Orson drove into town for a practical list. Dog food for the neighbors' muddies sometimes watched, a new furnace filter, batteries for the old flashlight he still kept by the bed. The hardware store was crowded with last-minute shoppers and the smell of pine-scented cleaner. Near the paint aisle, he heard two men talking in that casual, boastful tone people use when they've had a little luck and want to sound like skill. They traded stories about storage auctions, about units that were mostly broken furniture until one box paid for everything. Orson didn't step closer, but he listened the way he'd always listen on calls. Not for drama, but for what didn't fit. One man said the best units weren't messy ones. The best ones looked organized, like the renter expected to return. That line followed Orson all the way home, settling in his mind like an ember that refused to go cold. That night, sleet tapped the windows and the living room glowed with a single lamp. Orson opened his laptop more out of restlessness than belief, scrolling through local auction listings that blurred together: bags of clothes, sagging mattresses, cardboard towers collapsing under dust. Then he stopped on a listing that felt different in a way he couldn't name at first. The photo showed a storage unit filled wall-to-wall with identical black plastic totes, each topped with a bright yellow lid, stacked in tight, straight rows like a warehouse display. No loose junk, no couch cushions, no random trash. Just repetition, symmetry, and lids snapped shut as if the contents mattered enough to seal. The note below was bare bones: long-term renter, account delinquent, sold as is, no preview. Orson leaned closer to the screen, noticing small details most people would ignore, like how the stacks didn't bow, how the tote handles lined up, how the floor space at the entrance looked unusually clean. It wasn't wealth that tugged at him. It was a feeling that someone had built a system, then vanished before finishing whatever the system was for. By morning, the sky looked like dull metal, and the town's holiday lights hung in tired loops over wet streets. Orson drove out just to see the place, telling himself it was research, the same way he used to walk the perimeter of a building before entering. The facility sat off a two-lane road behind a chain-link gate, rows of doors stretching into the cold. Inside the office, a young woman in a winter beanie and a navy polo looked up from a clipboard. Her name tag read Maris. She spoke with the careful friendliness of someone who had learned to be polite without inviting trouble, and when Orson asked about the tote-filled unit J14, according to the listing, she didn't answer too quickly. She said it had been rented for years, paid in cash, always on time, and then the payment stopped right after Thanksgiving. They'd mailed notices, called a number, tried the emergency contact, and got nothing that connected to a real person. Maris kept her voice low, not dramatic, just honest. Organized renters, she said, didn't usually disappear in the middle of the season. Orson walked the outer lane of units afterward, hands in his coat pockets, breath visible in short clouds. He didn't touch the door at J14, and he didn't ask to see inside, because he knew the rules and respected them. Still, he stopped in front of it for a long moment, let his eyes take in what they could. A latch with faint scratches, a newer padlock that looked recently swapped, a thin line of swept concrete at the base as if someone had stood there often. None of it proved anything, but it all suggested movement and intent. Back in his truck, he sat with the heater blowing and thought about the small cash envelope in his kitchen drawer, the one he'd started after his wife passed, telling himself it was for something decent when the right moment arrived. He had used it for emergencies and tires and groceries, but he'd never used it for a chance. On impulse, he pulled up a storage auction channel he sometimes watched late at night when sleep wouldn't come, and he scrolled through the comment section like it was a porch full of neighbors. Before he shut the app, he hit like on a video, subscribed without thinking, and left a short comment, just one line about being retired and curious, then felt almost embarrassed by how good it felt to do something small and forward. That evening, the house smelled faintly of coffee and the cinnamon candle his wife used to light in December. Orson spread his bills on the table, Not as a sob story, but as a map of reality. Rent, utilities, medication, the car insurance due after the holidays. He set a limit he would not cross, because pride didn't pay late fees, and he knew the difference between hope and denial. Yet when he opened the auction page again, he found himself studying the tote photo as if it were a puzzle that might contain an answer to his own stalled life. He registered for the sale, entered his maximum as a proxy bid, and forced himself to hit confirm before he could talk himself out of it. The screen flashed a simple message that his bid was active. Orson closed a laptop and stood in the quiet kitchen, listening to hum of the refrigerator, feeling his pulse steady instead of spike. He hadn't won anything yet, but he had given tomorrow reason to matter. The next morning, the online countdown ran toward 0, while Orson watched with the same focus he used to bring to an uncertain doorway. Bids rose in sharp little jumps. Names he didn't recognize pushing a number higher, then pausing, then pushing again. Orson didn't chase wildly. He adjusted once, carefully, then held, jaw tight, palms flat on the table as if grounding himself. When the timer hit the end, the page refreshed, and for a heartbeat the screen went blank except for a spinning wheel that made his stomach drop. Then the result loaded. Orson Hale, winning bidder for Unit J14, payment due by close of business. He stared until the words stopped looking like a trick of light. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, and somewhere down the street a neighbor's inflatable snowman squeaked in the wind. Orson grabbed his coat, his keys, and the envelope of cash and drove toward the storage facility with a strange mix of dread and relief. He told himself he would follow every rule, sign every form, do everything clean, because he had no room in his life for trouble. But as he parked and saw Maris waiting with paperwork and a brass key, one question pressed harder than all the others. If those neat yellow lids were hiding something worth building a future on, why had the person who packed them so carefully never come back to open them again? The door to Unit J14 rolled up with a hard metallic rattle that echoed down the corridor doors, and the cold air inside felt drier than the winter outside. Rows of black totes with bright yellow lids rose from the concrete floor to just below the ceiling, stacked so perfectly that the unit looked less like abandoned storage and more like a private warehouse. The symmetry was unsettling in a quiet way, because it suggested routine, and routine suggested a person who expected to return. A thin film of dust sat evenly on the lids, but not in the messy, neglected pattern he was used to seeing in basements and garages. It looked like time had passed without interruption, not chaos. The young employee stayed near the threshold with her clipboard, respectful of the rules, and also clearly fighting curiosity. He stepped in slowly, boots scraping grit, and noticed a narrow aisle left down the center, as if someone had planned for access, not just stacking. When he gripped the handle of the nearest tote to test its weight, the plastic flexed slightly, and something inside shifted with a dense, muted clunk that did not sound like clothing or holiday decorations. His chest tightened in that familiar way it used before entering a smoky room. No panic, just readiness. And he set the tote back down gently, suddenly aware that this place had its own kind of pressure. He started the way experience had taught him to start with anything unknown, by making it orderly. A clamp lamp and a cheap folding table came out of his truck, along with a notebook, a marker, and the old phone he used mostly for calls and photos. He wrote the unit number and date at the top of the page, then numbered each tote row by row, not because he expected a crime scene, but because confusion was expensive when you were alone and on a clock. The first lid snapped open with sharp plastic clicks, and the contents were surprisingly tame at first glance. Bundles of cords tied with Velcro straps, labeled radio parts in small zip bags, an old metal tin lined with wax paper, and a stack of instruction manuals for equipment he didn't recognize. None of it was dangerous on its own, but none of it felt random either. Everything was grouped by type, wrapped, and cushioned as if it mattered. The second tote held sealed envelopes of coins, each envelope marked with dates in a tight, slanted hand, some of them decades old, some recent, with small notes like circulated and uncleaned. The third tote changed the tone again, several compact metal cases, each with a different lock style, padlocks, combination dials, sliding latches, nestled into foam like instruments, not keepsakes. The pattern was clear now. This was an attic dumped into plastic. This was inventory, layered and sorted by someone who thought in systems. A few aisles in, the employee finally spoke in a low voice, more to steady herself than to start a conversation. "I've never seen one packed like this," she said. He didn't answer right away, because he was listening to the unit the way he used to listen to a building. Small sounds, small warnings. When he lifted another tote, the contents shifted with a metallic rattle that made him pause. He moved slower after that, choosing lids carefully, avoiding anything that felt pressurized or oddly sealed. One tote held maps folded into protective sleeves, several marked with red circles and pencil arrows, alongside a thick notebook filled with columns of numbers and short abbreviations that meant nothing to him. Another held a strange mix: vintage postcards, a sealed envelope of foreign currency, and a brass compass that still swung smoothly when he tilted it. There were photographs, too. Men standing beside crates of machinery in poorly lit rooms, faces turned away or cut off at the edges, as if the photographer had cared more about what was on the table than who was in the frame. It wasn't the kind of family history people store for sentiment. It looked like someone collecting proof. The retired man felt the stakes tighten, not because he knew what it meant, but because he knew what careful people did when they were afraid of forgetting or of being erased. By the time the clamp lamp had warmed the back half of the unit with its yellow cone of light, his hands had gone cold enough to sting, and his mind kept flipping between two truths. One truth said he had paid for this legally, signed the papers, and was allowed to clear out like any other winning bidder. The other truth said that some lives didn't end neatly, and sometimes their leftovers carried problems that wanted new owners. He took a short break at the entrance, sipping coffee from a thermos, watching his breath fog and vanish. The employee glanced at the rows of lids, like they might move on their own. "Those storage videos you mentioned, do they always look like this?" she asked, half joking, half serious. He managed a small smile and shook his head. "Usually it's broken furniture and old clothes," he said, keeping his voice calm on purpose. A thought came to him then, how the better videos always preach documentation, patience, and doing the right thing when something fell off. And he pulled out his phone to photograph the tote numbers and content again, more thoroughly this time. If anyone listening at home ever wondered what they would do in this moment, he hoped they'd say they would slow down, hit like on caution instead of greed, subscribe to good sense, and leave a comment that didn't push a stranger toward a bad decision. The idea wasn't a speech. It was a private reminder. The safest choice was often the one people didn't applaud. He went back in, deeper, where the air felt stiller and the stacks narrowed the aisle. A tote with mismatched lid looked out of place against all that precision, and that difference bothered him more than the lock cases had. Inside were ordinary items on top: children's books, worn sneakers, faded shirts, so normal they felt staged, like a blanket thrown over something that mattered. Under the shirt sat a small metal box that clinked when he lifted it, and when he opened it, he found dozens of memory cards labeled with tiny dates spanning years. The labels were so small and consistent they could have been made by someone with a label maker, yet they were handwritten, careful, and patient. His stomach tightened. Because people don't keep that kind of timeline unless they're recording something they fear will be questioned later. He set the box aside and opened another tote that was heavier than it should have been for paper goods. Inside, protected in sleeves and flat boxes, were vintage comic books, some graded, some sealed, covers bright as fresh paint despite their age. Not one or two, but stacks, curated like a collection built slowly with money and obsession. He could almost see the resale value in his mind, and for a split second the old hunger for relief flickered. Pay down bills, fix the truck, buy groceries without counting. Then the flicker cooled, replaced by a heavier thought. Valuable things don't sit forgotten without a reason, and if someone went to this much trouble, someone else might go looking. Near the back wall, he found what looked like a work tote: flashlight, gloves, microfiber cloths, a compact toolkit. Items that belonged to someone who visited this unit repeatedly rather than abandoning it. The industrial flashlight still worked, its beam slicing to the dimness with surprising strength. And in that bright line, he noticed faint scrape marks along the concrete in the lower wall, as if heavy containers had been dragged in and out over time. That was when he saw it. A folded piece of paper wedged behind the tote, pressed so tight against the wall it looked hidden by accident. The paper was worn and creased, like it had been handled with nervous fingers. It wasn't a dramatic warning, and it wasn't written like a movie prop. It read like the start of a note someone never finished. The ink pressed too hard at the beginning and fading toward the end. "I didn't have time to finish the list." Start with it, and then nothing. The last word cut off as if the writer had been pulled away mid-thought. He stood very still, the flashlight beam trembling slightly, and felt something he hadn't expected to feel since retirement. Responsibility returned like a weight settling onto his shoulders. The employee stepped closer, saw his face, and stopped talking. Whatever the story was, it wasn't clean. He chose the two unmarked totes at the far corner next, the ones without numbers or labels, because he couldn't keep circling them like a man afraid to look under a bed. The first unmarked lid released with muted pop, as if it had been sealed tight for a long time. Inside were black fabric pouches tied with cords, each pouch heavy and dense. When he loosened one, metal components slid into his palm, precision-cut pieces, clean edges, parts that looked purpose-made rather than scavenged from common tools. Under the pouches was a packet of technical drawings, Not glossy blueprint from a store, but printed schematics annotated by hand in the same tight slanted writing. The drawings showed modular layouts, wiring paths, measurement notes, and repeated references to cartridges, cells, and test logs, language that sounded like energy storage work rather than anything meant for harm. Still, the care and secrecy around it made his skin prickle. At the bottom, taped to the inside wall of the tote, was a manila envelope. He didn't open it right away. He held it, felt a few stiff sheets inside, and tried to decide whether the next step was curiosity or caution. Finally, he slid the flap open and pulled out a single page that made his throat go dry, a list of locations written as plain addresses and coordinates, 4 lines total, and one of them referenced an old industrial site he knew too well, an abandoned plant where a winter fire years ago had burned hotter than it should have, bringing in officials who didn't wear turnout gear and didn't answer questions. He didn't say the name of the place aloud, but his eyes lifted and met the employees, and she read the shift in him immediately. The tote sat open at his feet, the yellow lids around them suddenly looking less like harmless plastic and more like sealed chapters of someone else's life. Outside the unit, Christmas lights on the office building blinked cheerfully against the gray sky, a simple world pretending nothing complicated existed behind roll-up doors. He folded the list carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and stared at the remaining unmarked tote. The last one in the far corner, strapped down with 2 old bungee cords, as if someone had tried to keep it from shifting. He could hear his own breathing, slow and controlled, the way it had to be when something important was about to happen. If those coordinates tied this unit to a fire he remembered, then this wasn't just a strange collection with resale value. It was a trail. And the real question was no longer what he might sell, but who else might still be following that trail, and what they would do if they realized an ordinary retired man had just picked up the next piece. The bungee cord snapped free with a sharp elastic twang that echoed off the metal walls, and the sound made the employee flinch even though nothing else moved. The retired firefighter kept his hand steady, lifting the lid only an inch at first, then another, letting the stale air escape in a thin, dry breath. Inside, foam cutouts held dozens of identical metal cylinders, each about the size of a large thermos, each engraved with a simple number and capped with a seal valve that didn't match any household tool he'd ever handled. The arrangement was too careful to be casual, and too standardized to be a hobbyist's random stash. He didn't grab one right away. He hovered, listening for any hiss, any chemical smell, any sign that the content were unstable. Nothing leaked, nothing rattled, yet the silence felt loaded. When he finally lifted a cylinder by its body, it surprised him with a dense, honest weight, the kind that spoke of layered components and purpose-built design. He set it back into the foam as gently as if it were glass, and his mind pulled up old instincts. Don't rush, don't guess, don't assume you're the smartest person in the room. The employee's eyes stayed fixed on the tote as if she expected it to start vibrating, but what scared him more was how calm it all looked, like this was exactly how the unknown renter wanted it stored. He moved the clamp lamp closer and began photographing everything with slow, methodical care, because memory could be questioned and photos could be dated. The tote wasn't alone. Tucked along the foam edge were small zip bags of specialized fittings and short braided cables, each labeled with tiny tape strips in that same tight, slanted handwriting. A thin binder sat beneath the foam flap, protected in plastic, filled with test logs printed on plain paper and marked by hand with check marks, times, and short notes like heat rise acceptable and do not stack warm. That last phrase tightened his throat more than any dramatic warning ever could, because it sounded like someone who had learned a lesson the hard way. A second envelope slid out when he lifted the binder, and this one wasn't flashy either. Just a standard manila sleeve with a list of serial numbers matching the engravings on the cylinders, plus a column of dates that stopped abruptly near the start of winter. He didn't have to be an engineer to understand the rhythm of it. Something had been tested repeatedly, documented, and then suddenly abandoned. The employee took one step closer, then stopped herself at the threshold, as if crossing the line would make it real. "Are those batteries?" she asked, voice small. "I don't know," he replied, keeping it simple, because guessing out loud could turn into panic. What he did know was that the cylinders, the logs, the memory cards, the maps, and the photos all belonged to a single story that didn't want to be found by accident. The cold outside hit his face when he stepped out to breathe, and it felt like relief even though it shouldn't have. Christmas lights along the office roof blinked in cheerful colors, and the contrast made his stomach twist, because the world looked normal while his hands still smelled faintly of plastic and cold metal. He stood beside the open door, watching his breath fog, and he realized how quickly one small decision could snowball into something that didn't fit the life he'd been living. A week ago, he had been measuring his days in medication bottles and grocery totals. telling himself that quiet was just how retirement was supposed to feel. Now, the quiet felt like the moment before a call came in, the kind of pause that didn't last. He thought about his grandchildren and the way they talked about online videos with excited certainty, always convinced there was an obvious answer if you just watched long enough. It made him think, briefly, about all the people who would love to hear a story like this and would say the same three things. Hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment about what you'd do next, because it's easier to be brave from a warm chair than from a cold storage corridor. He didn't resent that. He understood it. He simply wished, in that moment, that the people who enjoyed mysteries also understood the weight of being the one who had to choose the next step without a script. When he went back in, he forced himself to keep working the unit like a slow, careful audit instead of a scavenger hunt. The collectibles were still there, quietly valuable in their own right, and he separated them into clearly labeled stacks. Graded comics, camera bodies and lenses, sports cards, and a smaller pile of military medals and folded flags that deserved respect rather than resale hype. The odd mix bothered him, because it suggested the unit wasn't just one-person storage. It felt like a funnel, a place where different lives have been gathered and sorted into categories that serve someone else's purpose. The employee, Marisol, according to her name tag, though he only noticed now, held her clipboard against her chest as if it could protect her. She mentioned carefully that the renter had paid in cash for years and rarely spoke, and that the lock had been replaced more than once at the tenant's request. That detail landed hard, because people replace locks when they're worried about who else has a key. He asked if the facility had cameras facing this row, and she nodded, saying the main drive did, but not every corridor. He didn't like that answer, yet he kept his voice even, because fear could spread quickly in small spaces. He closed the cylinder tote again without sealing it tight, set a clear, do not move note on top for himself, and made a decision that felt both frustrating and necessary. He would not remove any of the technical items today, not until he knew who should see them first. He chose one more tote before stopping, the one that had been taped shut again and again, as if someone had sealed it in layers over months. Inside sat a leather-bound journal and a plain envelope, nothing else, placed as neatly as a final gesture. He didn't read the journal like a thriller. He skimmed with the practiced eyes of someone trained to find the important line, without drowning in the noise. The early pages were calm and practical, notes about modules, field tests, spires, pressure checks, and keep backups off-site. Words that sounded like a person building something legitimate that had drifted into something riskier. Then the tone changed the way smoke changes when a fire starts eating something toxic. The handwriting tightened, the sentences shortened, and the dates began skipping. There were mentions of being followed, of meetings moved to public places only, of payments switched to cash for safety, and of keeping parts separated so nobody can assemble without the full set. One page referenced a prior industrial fire at a remote site, not in dramatic language, but as if it were a marker in a timeline. After the plant incident, they accelerated, and that phrase hit him like ice water because he'd been at a plant fire years ago that never made full sense. He remembered the odd smell, the officials who arrived too quickly, the sealed paperwork afterward. The envelope contained 4 sets of coordinates, matching what he'd already found, and one of them aligned with that memory so cleanly that he felt his pulse jump. He shut the journal slowly, not because he was done, but because he had reached a point where continuing alone felt less like curiosity and more like walking into a structure without calling for backup. They rolled the door down to a halfway point, enough to obscure the unit from casual view, while still allowing him to keep working if needed, and he asked Marisol to walk with him to the office under the excuse of signing a second copy of the receipt. The walk down the corridor felt longer than before, and he found himself noticing small things that hadn't mattered an hour ago. A fresh scuff mark in the gravel, a cigarette but still damp from recent use, the faint whine of a vehicle idling somewhere beyond the rows. He didn't point out. He simply stored it. In the office, he asked the manager's card and the facility's policy on reporting suspicious items, keeping the language neutral. Marisol watched him like she was trying to decide whether he was calm or just hiding it well, and he couldn't blame her. He told her one clear boundary. If anyone came asking about Unit J14, she should not confirm anything beyond it's been auctioned, and she should call him first. She agreed too quickly, and the speed of her nod told him she had already been thinking the same thing. When they stepped back outside, a dark SUV sat at the far edge of the lot near the main road, motionless, angled as if it could leave fast. It might have been nothing. It might have been someone waiting for a friend. But he'd spent too many winters watching the world through smoke to ignore shape that didn't belong. He drove home with the journal tucked under an old sweater on the passenger seat, the kind of small concealment that wouldn't stop a determined person but might deter casual eyes. Holiday decorations glowed in windows along the street, and the warmth of them made him feel lonelier than usual, because he could almost hear his late wife laughing at how life refused to stay simple. At home, he didn't pour a drink or pace. He made coffee, wrote down a timeline on a legal pad, and called one person he still trusted to handle hard situations without turning them into drama. His former station captain, a man who had spent decades coordinating with investigators after suspicious fires and industrial accidents. The call was short and careful, more logistics and confession, and when the captain heard the phrase plant incident and test logs, his tone changed immediately. He told him, calmly, not to post anything, not to sell anything, and not to return alone. Then he asked one question that sat heavy in the silence that followed. Did anyone see you open that unit? The retired man looked at the journal, then at the cold window, then at his own hands, and realized the truth was uncomfortable. Someone could have seen. Someone might already know. And the most frightening part wasn't what was inside those totes anymore. It was a possibility that whoever had abandoned them might not be the only one who still cared where they ended up. When he returned to the facility the next morning, the gravel looked freshly disturbed near the corridor, as if a vehicle had been parked there overnight despite the posted rules. The padlock on his unit wasn't missing, but the shackle showed a new scratch, bright metal against dull weathering, the kind that didn't come from normal key use. He stood there in the winter air, hearing distant traffic and the faint buzz of the office lights, and felt the same cold certainty he used to feel when he arrived at a scene and knew something had already changed before he got there. He didn't open the door. He didn't touch the lock again. He simply turned his head, scanning the rows, the corners, the gaps between buildings, and the far end of the lot where that dark SUV could appear without warning. If someone had tested the lock, it meant the story inside Unit J14 had leaked into the world faster than he could control. And the question that mattered now wasn't what he would find next inside. It was who would show up first, and what they would demand when they realized he still had the only key. The bright scratch on the padlock stayed in the retired firefighter's mind like a splinter he could not ignore, because it was a kind of detail that meant someone had touched his life while he slept. The morning air cut through his coat as he stood in front of Unit J14, listening to the lot's usual sounds. The far-off hiss of traffic, a cart rattling somewhere near the office, the thin whine of fluorescent lights behind a window dressed with holiday tinsel. Nothing looked damaged, and nothing looked rushed, yet the new mark on the shackle sat there like proof of a careful test. He didn't open the door, not even an inch, because he understood the difference between curiosity and control, and right now control mattered more than answers. Marisol watched him from several steps back, arms folded tight, her face pale in the cold. She offered to call the manager, then hesitated, as if saying the wrong thing would make the problem grow teeth. He asked her for one practical favor instead. Pull the gate log for the last 2 nights and check whether any staff had been on this row after closing. She nodded and went to the office, boots crunching gravel, leaving him alone with the metal door and the sick feeling that the unit had stopped being just a purchase. When she returned, the report was thin and frustrating. No staff listed, no maintenance ticket, no reason anyone should have been here, and that lack of reason made his stomach tighten more than a clear answer ever would. He kept his movement slow as they walked to the office, because hurried steps attract attention in places built for quiet routines. Inside, warmth and stale coffee smell wrapped around them, and the clerk's radio played soft seasonal music that felt wrong against the pressure in his chest. He asked Marisol to print a clean copy of his auction receipt and facility rules, not because he forgot them, but because paper calmed him and paper created a timeline. She did it without questions, then slid him a small note with the camera policy written in her neat handwriting, explaining which lanes were covered and which were blind. He thanked her, and she forced a small smile, the kind people use when they want to be brave for someone else. On the counter sat a little acrylic sign for Facility's holiday charity drive, urging customers to like the community page, subscribe to text alerts for auction updates, and comment if they recognized any unclaimed items from past renters. Marisol glanced at it and said quietly, "Sometimes that's the only way families find things back." He nodded and took a photo of the sign, thinking how strange it was that the same 3 actions could be both ordinary and useful when a story turned messy. Before they left, he typed a short note into the charity post on his phone, keeping it vague but honest. A unit had turned up with unusual equipment, and if anyone recognized the packing style, they should reach out to the office. It felt like a small net cast into cold water, but small nets sometimes caught the right fish. He didn't go home right away, because home had too many quiet corners and too few witnesses. Instead, he drove to a diner near the old station where he used to eat after long shifts, the kind of place with fog windows and a bell that rang when the door opened, and he texted his former captain to meet him there. The captain arrived in a heavy coat dusted with snow, gray hair tucked under a knit cap, eyes steady in a way that pulled the room back into focus. They kept the conversation practical and contained, leaning over coffee like two men discussing a broken furnace rather than a storage unit that felt like a trap. The retired firefighter laid out what mattered: the cylinders and foam, the test logs, the memory cards with years of dates, the journal that read like someone building an insurance policy against the wrong people, and the coordinates that pointed toward an industrial fire he remembered too well. The captain listened without dramatic reactions, and that calmness helped, because panic would have made everything feel larger than it was. When he finished, the captain asked 3 questions. Who knew what had been removed, and whether the unit had been left open long enough for someone to film the contents from the aisle. The answers were imperfect, and the captain did not pretend otherwise. He told him to do 2 things today: move every sensitive document out of his house into a safe deposit box, and stop opening any additional totes until he had a plan that kept him from standing alone in a blind corridor with his back turned. By mid-afternoon, the sky turned the flat gray of late December, and he did what he hated doing most. He admitted he needed help. The captain made a call from the parking lot, not to the local desk, but to a contact who handled suspicious industrial cases without turning them into public spectacle. The captain didn't promise a cavalry or an instant fix, and he didn't speak like television, which made the conversation feel more believable. He explained that a retired first responder had purchased an abandoned unit containing unfamiliar components and documentation that matched past incidents, and that someone appeared to have tested the lock overnight. The contact asked for photos of serial numbers and the test logs, then gave one instruction that sounded simple and heavy at the same time: secure what you have, don't move the cylinders, and don't start selling anything connected to the technical side. That last part mattered, because bills did not pause the mysteries, and he still had a life to keep afloat. The captain looked at him and added something gentler, because he knew the real pressure. If there's clean money in the collectibles, take it, but do it smart and do it documented. That became the compromise. Protect the dangerous puzzle pieces, but begin converting the harmless value into breathing room before winter swallowed the last of the savings. The first place they tried was a pawn shop near the highway, chosen because it was open late and had bright lights, not because it felt safe. He carried only a small sample: 2 graded comics, 1 vintage camera body, and a handful of sports cards, items that could be valuable without dragging the unit's darker story into the room. The owner's smile came too fast and lasted too long, and his questions arrived before he even looked closely at the items. He asked where they came from, whether there was more like this, whether the seller was alone, and whether the seller had any weird metal stuff mixed in with the boxes. The retired firefighter kept his voice calm and answered like a man buying tires. Estate clean out, mixed lot, still sorting, no rush. The owner offered an insulting number, then tried to sweeten it with friendliness, tapping a finger on the comic case as if it belonged to him already. The captain didn't raise his voice. He simply stood up, collected the items, and said they would think about it. As they walked out, the bell over the door sounded too cheerful for the feeling following them into the parking lot. A car that had been empty when they arrived eased backward from the side row, headlights off, and rolled out behind them at a polite distance. The captain didn't call a threat. He called a reason to be careful, and he guided the truck toward the fire station visitor lot, where cameras watched the entrance all night. The follower did not pull in, but it also didn't disappear quickly, which told them something without proving anything. They went to a second place just before closing, a small collectibles shop tucked beside a laundromat, run by 2 brothers who looked barely old enough to shave, but spoke with the careful patience of people who had been forced to grow up fast. The shop smelled like cardboard and plastic sleeves, and the counter glass was filled with coins, patches, and old pins laid out like tiny museum pieces. One brother inspected the comic grading and the camera serial number with clean hands and no rush, while the other pulled recent auction results on a tablet and explained the ranges without trying to scare anyone into a quick sale. They didn't offer a fairy tale number, but they offered something better: a fair consignment plan, a paper trail, and a promise to store everything in a back safe until the sale date. When they heard the seller was retired fire service, their tones softened, and one of them admitted he and his brother had bounced through foster homes before landing on their feet. It wasn't a confession meant for sympathy. It was simply the truth behind why they didn't prey on older people who looked tired. The retired firefighter felt something in his chest loosen, because in a day full of shadows, honest people still existed. He left the samples with them under a signed receipt, and the brothers helped carry a sealed box to the truck, so his back wouldn't flare up in the cold. It was the first moment all day that felt like the world might still be balanced, even if the unit wasn't. That night, he didn't sleep much, but he also didn't spiral, because he learned long ago that fear grows faster in darkness without a plan. He moved the journal, the coordinate list, and his printed timeline into a safe deposit box before the bank closed. Keeping only digital copies on a drive he could hide easily. He checked his porch camera twice, then checked the street through a slit in the blinds, watching Christmas lights shimmer on neighbor hedges like the world was trying to stay normal by force. Near midnight, his phone buzzed with a message from Marisol that was short and shakier than her usual text. The facility manager had found fresh footprints by the side gate, and the lock on the gate latch looked like someone had tried to shim it. He stared at the screen, feeling that familiar cold certainty settle behind his ribs, the one that used to arrive when smoke behavior changed and a room became unsafe. He called the captain, and the captain told him to meet at the facility at first light, no detours, no stopping for coffee, and no going alone. When dawn finally came, he pulled into the lot and saw something that made his hands tighten on the steering wheel. A thin strip of bright tape tied to the corner of his unit door, the kind of marker people use when they want to know if something has been opened. It wasn't there yesterday, and it wasn't placed by staff. He didn't touch it. He didn't even breathe right for a second. He just understood, with a quiet dread that felt worse than sirens, that someone had returned overnight and left a signal for someone else. And the next decision, opening that door with witnesses or walking away and letting the wrong person come first, was about to cost him far more than money. The strip of bright tape on the roll-up door looked harmless from a distance, almost like something a careful manager might use to mark maintenance. Yet the retired firefighter knew better than to confuse neatness with safety. He waited in his truck until the captain arrived, then watched two plain sedans ease into the lot with the quiet confidence of people who hated being noticed. The morning had that brittle winter light that makes metal look sharper, and the gravel under their boots sounded too loud for how cautious everyone moved. Marisol met them at the office door with a clipboard and tired eyes, pointing out the side gate latch and the footprints that had drifted half full with snow. Nobody made a speech, and nobody tried to turn it into drama. The captain introduced the visitors as investigators assigned through his industrial contact, and they went straight to business. One of them photographed the tape without touching it, then asked Marisol for camera coverage on the row and for the gate log she had already pulled. The other stood angled toward the lot entrance, scanning parked vehicles the way firefighters scan rooftops for sagging lines. The door stayed shut until everything that could be documented was documented, because once it opened, the unit stopped being a rumor and became a chain of custody problem. When they finally cut the tape, it came away too easily, like it had been placed to be read rather than resisted. The investigator held it up to the light, then bagged it with the calm of someone collecting fingerprints from a window frame. Inside, the rows of black totes with yellow lids still looked almost unreal, as if a life had been shrink-wrapped into tidy rectangles and stacked with military patience. The air was dry and flat, the scent of plastic and dust mixing with cold concrete, and that stillness made every latch click feel like an alarm. The retired firefighter did not touch anything first. He let the investigators choose a tote, photograph the lid, record the printed numbers, and open in a way that made it clear nothing had been staged. The question stayed simple and pointed. What had been removed? Where had it been stored? Who else had seen it? And had he spoken about it to anyone beyond the captain and Marisol? He answered without decorating the story, because honesty was the only protection he had left. When the investigators reached the tote with the cylinders, they did not panic or flinch, yet their posture tightened in a way that told him he was right to stop opening things alone. They did not explain what the objects were in detail, only that the components matched a pattern from an ongoing case involving stolen industrial technology and off-book transport. One investigator wrote down the dates on the memory cards. The other photographed the journal's cover and asked for the bank box receipt where the originals were stored. That request mattered because it meant he was no longer guessing whether he had done the right thing. The system was now building around his choices, and systems can protect people when they're used correctly. The next hours moved in waves, the way serious work often does. Quiet action, a brief pause, then the stakes lifting again. The investigators asked Marisol to shut down access to the row for the day, posting a polite sign about facility inspection. And she did it with steadiness that surprised even her. They brought a portable light, a small tripod camera, and evidence bags, working methodically through the items that clearly belonged to the technical story without disturbing the rest. The retired firefighter stood near the entrance, hands in his pockets, watching his ordinary decision to bid on a unit turn into something that now involved federal forms and careful language. He felt old in a way he hadn't felt at retirement, not weak, but aware that every wrong step could snap the thin bridge under him. At one point, he stepped outside for a breath, and Marisol followed, her cheeks red from the cold and from holding herself together. She admitted she had posted a vague note on the facility's holiday charity page like he asked, and that two strangers had already replied, asking which unit and offering help with hauling. That was the kind of attention he did not want. He asked her to delete the comments and lock the post, and she did it immediately, then said something practical that also carried a quiet plea. The facility's community page reached a lot of older renters, and if people found the story later, she hoped they would use it for good instead of gossip. He nodded and told her to keep the post up, but only as a reminder to be careful, and he added a short line asking neighbors to like the page, subscribe to safety updates, and comment only if they had real information about missing property. It fit the moment because it wasn't marketing. It was a small community net meant to catch the truth before the wrong hands did. By late afternoon, the investigators had enough to change the pressure in the air, not because they solved everything, but because they confirmed what mattered. The unit contained evidence linked to a bigger problem, and someone had likely checked the lock to see if the buyer had opened the wrong tote yet. The camera footage did not give a clean face, but it did show a dark SUV coasting past the row after hours, stopping just long enough for a figure in a hood to step out, place the tape, and leave. The detail that stuck was how careful the person was, avoiding direct light and keeping their hands gloved. That wasn't a curious teenager. The investigators didn't promise an arrest, and they didn't indulge the urge to say, "You're safe now," because they couldn't guarantee it. Instead, they offered something more realistic: a direct number, instructions to call them if anyone approached, and a written statement that the buyer was not a suspect and had acted responsibly. They also made it clear that the remaining items, collectibles, cameras, sports cards, personal memorabilia, and military keepsakes not tied to the technical case, could legally be kept or sold under the auction contract, as long as he documented what left his hands. That line was a relief so sharp it almost hurt, because money wasn't greed for him. It was medicine, tires, the ability to breathe through winter without counting coins at the grocery store. The captain insisted on one more step before anyone left. The unit door would be relocked with facility lock, the road would stay blocked off for 48 hours, and the buyer would not return alone. That boundary felt like surrender. Yet it was actually discipline, the kind that keeps people alive. The weeks that followed were not glamorous, and that was exactly why they worked. After the investigators removed the specific totes tied to their case, the retired firefighter returned with Marisol and the two brothers from the collectibles shop to clear the rest, because his back did not need heroics and his mind did not need isolation. The brothers, quiet, watchful, and surprisingly gentle, brought gloves, flat dollies, and a notebook, treating every box like it could be fragile even when it looked ordinary. They were the opposite of the highway pawn shop owner who would sniff for weakness, and the retired firefighter never forgot that difference. Together, they sorted by daylight and by simple rules: graded comics and cards in protective cases, cameras and lenses into padded bags, military medals and flags into a separate bin labeled donate or verify, and anything personal that felt like it belonged to a family story into one sealed tote marked hold. When they found a small stack of letters of commendation and a folded flag, Marisol's eyes filled even though she tried to blink it away. The retired firefighter set it aside without discussion, because some objects carry a weight that should not be turned into rent money. The brothers arranged consignment with a reputable auction house that specialized in pop culture and vintage media, and they kept everything on signed receipts with photos, because paperwork was protection and protection was peace. There were no miracle numbers, only fair ones, a few strong comic grades, a rare sports car that sold cleanly, a vintage camera lens that collectors still chased, and enough steady returns over 2 auctions to build a real cushion after commissions and taxes. It didn't turn him into a rich man, but it turned him back into a stable one. And stability is the kind of wealth older people feel in their bones. The threat did not vanish overnight, but it changed shape, which was its own kind of victory. Once the investigators were involved, the dark SUV stopped hovering near the facility, and the helpful strangers on the charity post never returned after Marisol locked comments and reported the accounts. A month later, a short update arrived through the captain. The evidence in the unit fit a larger timeline tied to a defunct energy contractor and a network of stolen prototype equipment. The note did not include names, and it did not offer a courtroom ending, yet it confirmed the point that mattered most. The dangerous part had been diverted into professional hands before anyone could misuse it. That was the sort of quiet ending the public rarely celebrates, but it was the ending that lets ordinary people keep living ordinary lives. With the immediate pressure gone, the retired firefighter did what he had promised himself he would do if he ever got a second chance at breathing room. He paid down the lingering medical bills that had been sitting like rocks on his kitchen counter. He replaced the 2 bald tires on his pickup before the first ice storm, not after. He repaired the leaky section of his roof and stopped placing buckets under drips like a man accepting defeat. He also did something that surprised him. He bought a plane ticket for just after New Year's to visit his son's family, not as a grand gesture to erase the past, but as a simple act of showing up. The call was awkward at first, then softer, and when he mentioned he could finally afford the trip, his son's voice cracked in a way men rarely allow. Nothing magical changed in one conversation. Yet the next photo that arrived of the grandkids in Christmas pajamas didn't feel like a reminder of distance. It felt like an invitation. By the time the holiday lights came down and winter settled into its quieter stretch, the unit itself became what storage units are supposed to be, an empty rectangle of concrete and metal, swept clean and rented to someone with a more ordinary reason to need space. Marisol earned a small raise and a new title at the facility, not because she chased drama, but because she stayed steady when the situation tried to bend her into fear. The two brothers received something better than a cash tip. The retired firefighter paid for their first month's rent in a safer apartment above the shop, then helped them build a simple inventory system that kept them from being exploited by shady sellers. He didn't announce it to anyone, because the point wasn't applause. The point was to pass forward the kind of fairness he wished his wife could have seen in practice again. The moral that settled over the whole story was not about treasure or luck, even though money did arrive in the end. It was about choices made under pressure, when nobody would have blamed him for walking away. He could have sold the wrong items to the wrong person and tried to cash out fast, but he didn't, because a life spent protecting strangers had taught him that easy often carries a hidden cost. Instead, he chose documentation, patience, and decent people, and those choices returned something deeper than cash: purpose after retirement, a safer community around him, and a future that felt open again. When New Year's Eve arrived, he stood on his porch with a mug of coffee, listening to distant fireworks and watching cold breath drift into the dark, and he understood something simple that he wished more people learned before they were 70. Courage is not always sirens and smoke. Sometimes it is a quiet decision to do the right thing when nobody is watching, and to let that decision rebuild your life one honest step at a time. The first real sign that life had settled again came in a small, almost embarrassing way. The house stopped sounding angry. The roof no longer popped inside during wind gusts, and the hallway didn't carry that damp smell that always followed a hard rain. On a clear morning in early January, he stood at the kitchen sink and watched sunlight move across the counter, noticing how his hands were steadier now that the constant math of bills had eased. The unit, the investigation, the auctions, and the tense weeks of waiting had not erased grief or rewritten the past, yet they had loosened the tight knot that had lived in his chest since retirement. He found himself doing simple things again, sharpening a pocket knife, wiping down tools, taking his time with coffee, without that gnawing feeling that every calm moment was borrowed from some looming disaster. The calm didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a door quietly closing behind him, so he could stop checking over his shoulder. Marisol's world changed in a different, steadier rhythm, the kind that built a future without needing a spotlight. Her job became more than keys and contracts. It became proof that she could stay clear-headed when fear tried to rush her into mistakes. The facility manager started asking her opinion before decisions, and the older renters, especially the ones who came in around holidays looking lonely, not just practical, began to trust her in a way that surprised her. She learned to keep boundaries without becoming cold, and she learned to spot the difference between a curious customer and someone hunting for leverage. When she finished her shift some evenings, she didn't go home with a familiar heaviness of feeling stuck. She went home with a list of small goals, like night classes, and a savings jar that actually grew. She didn't tell herself fairy tales about new beginnings. She just did the next right thing, then the next, and the next, until her life started to look like it belonged to her again. The two brothers from the collectibles shop stayed in the story for the same reason they mattered in the first place. They showed up when it was easy to look away, and they did it with decency. They kept their promises, handled the consignments with clean paperwork, and never once tried to squeeze extra profit out of an older man who didn't have energy for games. In time, he learned the quiet facts of their lives, the foster homes, the early jobs, the way they treated every customer like respect was a choice that cost nothing. It made him think about the people he had carried out of burning buildings years ago, and the people who had carried him afterward without ever asking for credit. He didn't save the brothers, and they didn't save him, but they did something rarer. They treated one another like dignity was normal. When he helped them move into a safer apartment above their shop, it wasn't charity dressed up as virtue. It was a practical investment in good people, the kind of decision that makes a community stronger without anyone needing to brag about it. The case itself faded into the kind of silence that keeps cities running without panic. There were no dramatic arrests on the evening news, and no reporter came knocking for an interview, which was honestly a relief. Once in a while, a short update arrived to the captain, carefully worded, deliberately unspecific, confirming that the dangerous pieces had been secured and that the broader investigation had reached a safe outcome. That phrase stayed with him. A safe outcome. Not a perfect one, not a satisfying one, but safe. He learned to accept that some victories happen in locked rooms, filed under boring titles, because the alternative would scare people who have enough fear already. And when he caught himself wondering about the engineer behind the unit, he tried to hold the thought without letting it poison his peace. Whoever that person had been, they left breadcrumbs in a way that let strangers make the right choice. In a world full of shortcuts, that mattered. The most personal change came quietly and without ceremony on a chilly weekend after New Year's, when he finally boarded a plane with a carry-on bag that didn't rattle like it used to. He landed in a city that smelled like wet pavement and pine, and the sun met him at the curb with a hesitant smile that turned real when the grandkids ran forward. The reunion wasn't a movie scene. It was messy and human, with pauses where old misunderstandings still lived. But there was also warmth, and there were moments that did not need words, like holding a small hand while crossing a parking lot, or reading a bedtime story with a voice that had once shouted orders through smoke. Later that night, sitting at the edge of the guest bed, he realized the greatest thing the storage unit had bought him wasn't comfort or repairs. It was time with people he didn't want to lose again, while he still had the strength to travel and the humility to show up. By the time he returned home, winter had settled into its slow, quiet middle, and the neighborhood looked ordinary again. Porch lights, bare trees, a few leftover decorations blinking lazily at dusk. He parked his pickup, carried his bag inside, and paused in the living room where his wife's sweater still hung on the hook. It didn't stab him the way it used to. It felt like a memory he could hold without bleeding. He understood that the moral of everything that happened wasn't take big risks or chase mystery, because that advice can ruin people as easily as it helps them. The real lesson was smaller and sturdier. When a strange opportunity shows up, the goal isn't to grab it faster than everyone else. It's to handle it with character, document the truth, ask for the right help, choose people who act clean when nobody forces them to. And if you ever find yourself at the edge of a decision that could change your life, try to choose a path that lets you sleep with a clear conscience afterward, because peace is worth more than any quick profit.